agreeing to post the color for us this morning. Okay. Please stand.
Come on up.
Request permission to post the color.
Permission granted.
Post color. Take. Half step forward, up. Come.
Please be seated. At this time, we'll ask Pastor Danny Crawford to come forward from Family Fellowship Church to lead us in our invocation.
Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for being our great God and King. We worship and praise you, and we're so thankful that we get to live in this great country, that God, you have given us the opportunity to live here in the greatest country in the world. We are so grateful for all those who have given their lives to serve in our military, to shed their blood so that we would be free from tyranny. We thank you for those that are serving even now. We ask, God, that you would just give us foresight to see what you have for our country into the future. As we live our lives for you and for this country in a godly way, I pray, God, that you would just bless each and every family, veteran here. God, give them a great day. We thank you for Audie Murphy. We thank you for guys that served well so that we could have our freedoms. We thank you most of all for your great love for us to send your Son. In his sweet name I pray, and everybody said, Amen.
At this time, we'll have the Pledge of Allegiance. If you'll please stand, and that'll be the last time I think I asked you to stand. So we won't go up and down. Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. You may be seated. At this time, we'll have Joan Wright come forward and sing the national anthem. Thank you. Maybe we will stand this one last time.
Sorry, folks. Would you sing with me? Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright
Welcome once again our 26th annual Audie Murphy Days. We're so delighted that you're here. A little housekeeping item, please turn your cell phone off, or on silent if you will, please. This year we do want to remember 3 people that we've lost this year that were heavily involved with the museum and this event. We have Stan Smith, David Williams, and Adrian Wiskowski, who was our director of the museum. I have a picture of David that I'll be displaying in the other room momentarily. They were a big part of Audie Murphy Day and often helped with all the planning for the last several years. Also, I want to thank the Audie Murphy Committee for putting together the program. Mary Winters, Bernie Hurl, Lou King, and all the volunteers are working hard this weekend to help us put on a wonderful event for you. Our first speaker this morning, this will be very interesting, is an adjunct professor in U.S. history at Collin College, received a BA in history from University of New Orleans and an MA in history from the University of North Texas. He has taught history to high school students for 17 years, then led the school's Gifted and Talented program for another 14 years, all while also teaching history in the evenings and summers for Collin College. Currently, he's retired from K-12 environment. He continues to teach history at the college level while also working as a consultant in educational training programs for nonprofits such as Texas Law Related Education and S3 Strategies, entitled Hiding in Plain Sight. His program this morning will explore how the Allies deployed cleverly deceptive and illusionary practices during the run-up to D-Day to accomplish a surprisingly successful degree of deception in order to keep German plans for a counteroffensive at bay. Please join me in welcoming Mark Wellborn.
Well, good morning, everybody. I want to thank all of the veterans in the room and their families for everything they've done for all of us. So thank you very much. Also want to make sure to thank the Society, thank the museum for having me here today. I'm very excited, humbled, and honored to be here. I also have to prove I'm here. My wife was still asleep when I left, so if you would be so kind, I'll hold my phone up, and if you'll wave that one on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Thank you very much. That's very helpful, I promise, okay? Well, thank you for that great introduction. Again, my name's Mark Wellborn. I've been in education now for 40 years. Public school, high school, college, everything else. And I frequently get people ask me when I tell them I teach history, they frequently ask me, what's your specialty? And I say students. And the day that's not my answer is the day I shouldn't teach anyone. Okay. So as you're talking to people out there and there's argument over what should be taught, remember what is taught are students. Okay. So that's just part of my crusade. Don't forgive me for that. Thank you for the introduction there again. As I was putting the day together for this discussion, and I always like to have something up here. Okay. By the way, I do wander a little bit, so I'm just curious. If I wander over here, I have it. Can you hear me in the back? Yes. See, I've still got that voice that does that. Okay, very good. I'll try not to very often, but I can't control myself now and then. As I was putting this together and naming it, because you know you have to have a name for everything, I put on Hiding in Plain Sight. And as I was thinking about that, I was challenged a little bit here because I kept thinking about trying to hide 7,000, these are round numbers, 7,000 ships and landing craft. Where do you hide those? 150,000 men, where do you hide those? Not counting all of their support services, all of their equipment stockpiled. Roughly 11,000 planes. Where do you hide those? On an island. Okay. And as I thought about it more and more, I realized, you know where you hide those? Because you have to. In plain sight. But the secret is what you put around it to distract what's already in plain sight. And in wartime, what you put around it can't just be interesting. The enemy has to perceive it as threatening. And so an elaborate plan was put together that actually were a series of puzzle pieces that eventually came together wonderfully and helped D-Day be the success that it was on a strategic level. Okay? So that's what I'd like to talk about today, and although it's not specific to Audie Murphy, I think we all know he was involved in this event called World War II. So it is tied into, and he is tied into our story in a way. Okay? So let me go ahead and begin with this idea of hiding in plain sight. In November and December of 1943, the big three, Churchill, FDR, and Stalin, met in Tehran, and they agreed to a summer offensive in 1944. And although our emphasis today obviously is going to be on the Western Front, it would take both fronts to defeat Germany. One side alone, one front alone wasn't going to be able to do that. And in Tehran, the biggest decision was finally opening up the long-awaited second front in Western Europe, the invasion of France. Okay, that was critical. Churchill, I want to read the quote so I get it right. Churchill is credited with saying this. If it's not an exact quote, it certainly is close. In wartime, truth is so precious that she should always be accompanied by a bodyguard of lies. And that's an interesting thought. And that builds the framework, if I can call it lies for a moment, of lies surrounding what you're hiding in plain sight. And appropriately, when it came time to plan all of the strategies for the summer offensive, which included D-Day and other things, it was named Operation Bodyguard, taken out of Churchill's thought. And Operation Bodyguard had several different layers, one of which involved Soviet troops. Soviet troops were needed in Scandinavia on the border with Norway to create an illusion of Soviet Union attacking Norway. That will tie into what the other allies were going to do as well. Okay? Now, again, our topic isn't the Eastern Front, but you have to give a little credit where it's due, and that is the Soviet Union had its hands full fighting on their own front. To commit troops in Scandinavia to a battle that will never happen was a sacrifice on Stalin's part. But he was committed to having a Western Front, and he realized he played a role in the invasion of Europe being successful on the Western Front. And that was his role. We also wanted to get Sweden and Turkey to give up their neutral status and cooperate or look like they were going to cooperate. And that's okay too. And rather than try to get Turkey and Sweden to cooperate in secret, part of the illusion was make a big deal about it. Talk about it being conducted in secret, and then have all your diplomats in public cars and seen all over the place with press taking pictures. So there was a lot of top secret, high publicity negotiation going on in Sweden and Turkey. That was success in and of itself, because part of the game is you want to keep the Germans guessing, okay? And on as many opportunities as possible. Operation Anvil was designated to move Allied troops from Italy to southern France in June of 1944, supporting the Normandy invasion. Now, Operation Anvil did not move in June. It didn't move until August, and its name was changed to Operation Dragoon. That's the effort that Audie was involved in. He was part of that maneuver there. Another operation was called Operation Ironside. There were a series of panzer units in South France, and I'll show you a map where they were in just a moment because it's important. A series of panzer units in South France that we didn't want the Germans to move when the invasion of Normandy began. So we put information, the Allies, I keep saying we like I was there. We started putting information out into the Axis powers, into Germany, that there was an attack coming at Bordeaux, France. so they wouldn't move those panzer units. There never was an attack for Bordeaux, but we needed the Germans to think that. Again, on the fringes of where everything's important. And then our big topic today is Operation Fortitude. How would we disguise the invasion at D-Day as much as you can? You can't pretend it's not going to happen. Hitler knew it was coming. He had been planning on us coming for years. So there's no true surprise. There's only, can we catch them off guard as much as possible to give us the best chance of success? Okay. That's a challenge, folks. When you stop and consider, surprise really isn't an option. And so how do you plan around that? The goal of Operation Fortitude was to keep German reinforcements away from Normandy for as long as possible. Eisenhower asked for 2 weeks, and he knew that was a dream. He needed 2 days. He will get almost a week from most German units before they were sent as reinforcements. 7 weeks from other units before Germany realized what was truly happening at Normandy. That's a remarkable degree of success. So how did they pull this off? Well, it didn't happen overnight, and deception in warfare isn't new. But every war has its own needs and its own generation to figure it out. The deception that will ultimately be used in D-Day began in a way with a man named Dudley Wrangel Clark, who was working in British commandos down in North Africa. He was in the Ethiopia, Egypt area. And he was just kind of messing around with the idea that what could we do to throw the Germans off, to perplex the Germans? He didn't have a deep plan, no amazing vision. He even tried exploding wooden sheep. That should give you an idea of where he's beginning. What can we do? Okay. Now, this is a man using a modern phrase. He thinks outside the box. Okay. By the way, the exploding sheep were not helpful. Okay. But it was a thought. Okay. He had another thought. What if I had some of my commandos change their patches all the time, because enemy spies are going to notice your uniforms, but not necessarily notice your face. So what if I had my commandos change their patches frequently, go out in the public in Egypt, and leak information about where the British troops were going to be, and all these different units. Okay? One of his commandos was a future actor named David Niven. Some of you might recognize. There's some great asides in this story. I'll try not to go down those rabbit holes, but there's some great asides. Well, anyway, so he tried this idea and he got the information out. The Germans took the bait. They said, oh, the British troops are going to be here. Unfortunately, the German troops moved to an area where the British were really going to attack. So it was a failure, other than the Germans listened. So it made him think deception in war is not about what the enemy thinks. It's about what the enemy does. So how do you create a plan to make your enemy act the way you want them to act, not think? That's an interesting challenge as well. He tried another idea in Egypt. He built a wooden port in the South Mediterranean with wooden ships, wooden piers. The Germans took it so seriously they bombed it. Pretty interesting. The Germans tried it. They should have hired him, glad they didn't. Because in Holland, they started building a wooden airfield with wooden planes to simulate an attack, more bombing, for Great Britain, hoping that would draw the British Air Force to attack it in the Luftwaffe. You can understand where that would go. Well, as the British planes were flying over during the construction of this wooden airfield, the Germans were very slow at building the planes. As a result, the British reconnaissance flights could see half-built wooden planes down on the field, later turned into a complete plane, and realized it was wooden. Now, I couldn't verify this. You know, the weird thing about historians are like detectives to a degree, okay? You don't want to believe everything you hear, just like you don't in a court of law. You want a second source. One source is not necessarily credible, which just destroys me speaking, I realize. But, so you want a second source. So I have no second source for this next comment, but I loved it so much, I just said, oh, I have to include this. I simply can't say it's absolutely true. Okay? That German wooden airfield, it is reported by at least one source, that a British bomber, feeling spunky, knew it was fake and dropped a wooden bomb on it. That's almost too good not to be true, right? It's almost too good not to be true. Because how would you even make that one up? From that point on, by the way, they didn't take that airfield seriously, and the Germans didn't continue building it. So these early efforts at deception were not very successful, as the Allies are wanting a plan put in place. They're asking an awful lot. The first attempt at a coordinated plan of deception was to cover Operation Torch, which was the invasion of North Africa in late 1942. And the plan was that there would be, from England, they would put barges around England as if they're moving tanks. They would clear piers as if ships are going to come in and men are going to be loaded. They changed patches on uniforms all across on many of the British and the now arriving American soldiers in England to make it look like a good ruse. And the goal was to make it look like there was going to be an invasion of Norway, an invasion of northern France, and a naval attack on the city of Calais in France. So they put this in motion, and they used some spies, and we'll talk about the spies in a moment, to get the information into the German intelligence as a forewarning. And you might say, why would you want to warn the Germans? Well, of course you'd want to warn them about what's not going to happen. The problem is, how do you trust a spy? The bigger problem is, how do you trust a double agent spy? The spy originally employed by Germany, who comes up to you later and says, hey, I got a deal. How do you trust that one? Thanks to, rabbit hole not to go down, but have to mention, thanks to the British cracking Enigma and the secret code the Germans used, and the Germans never realizing it, and thanks to Americans cracking magic and the Japanese not realizing it, we could actually track German intelligence. We could track which double agents were reporting and what they were reporting to the German intelligence system. And then we could follow how far up the chain of command did it go. Did it go into the military high command? Did it make it to the man himself? Isn't that an amazing thought? In this plan, the agents were put in motion. The messages made it all the way to the top. Okay, pretty amazing. The messages were sent as the invasion began of North Africa. The message was sent that it's coming to Normandy, etc. Okay. The Germans didn't take the bait. The messages went all the way up to the top. Germans didn't care. And that perplexed folks for a while, because it's pretty dangerous then to plan to cover the D-Day invasion and it isn't working. And prior experiences didn't. Wooden bombs aren't going to help. Interpreting what German intelligence was saying to itself, the Germans didn't believe there were enough troops in Great Britain to pull all of that off. Their understanding of U.S. troops to date, British troops, there isn't enough to attack Norway, northern France, and North Africa. So they didn't move. They did nothing. Now, there is a certain amount of success in that. Because they did nothing, no troops were sent down to North Africa to help. However, they didn't do nothing out of fear of another attack. They did nothing out of doing nothing. A lesson learned for the intelligence service was if you're going to plan this big ruse around D-Day, you've got to make it look like you can pull it all off. Otherwise, there's a good chance the Germans will figure out you're not going to do any of it, or they'll figure out what you're actually going to do. And that brings in this spy service. In 1936, there was a gentleman named Arthur Owens, who was an engineer, and he was traveling through Europe, this of course immediately before, just 3 years before the war begins. And he offered to the British, because he traveled throughout Europe and Germany, etc., he offered to the British to report on what he was seeing. He actually went to them and offered to report on what he was seeing in Germany. They weren't quite sure if they should take him up on it, but why not? Okay, there's nothing at risk yet. War had not yet begun. While he was traveling in Europe, he was also approached by German intelligence. Now, the military German intelligence is called the Abwehr, and I'll be mentioning them several times. It's not a separate service, it's part of the military. And the Abwehr approached him, not knowing that he was reporting to the British, and asked him, would you, when you travel through Britain, come back and tell us what you're seeing there, and we'll pay you well. Interesting about all these spies and double agents is the amount of money they made. There's definitely, there were political values involved for them, but it seems like the biggest draw was money. How much would they be able to get? Okay. And so he agreed to report to the Abwehr and reported to the British when he went back that the Abwehr had approached him. So they started playing with this notion of double agents. Can we use double agents to feed information? And when they were debating what kind of information do you feed your potential enemy, soon to be true enemy, do you feed them all lies? And they realized you can't feed them all lies, because if you feed them all lies, they'll figure that out and they won't listen to anyone. So we have to feed them, in addition to lies, real information that won't hurt anything. Verifiable information. So in case there's another spy we don't know about, it can be proven. And in the game, they called this chicken food. Have any of y'all ever raised chickens? My grandmother had chickens, and so I think of them pecking at the food and all of this work, and they're not getting much. Well, that was the idea behind this. We'll feed the Germans chicken food, but every now and then, some of the food will be real and verifiable. It'll be approved by the military, so that we're not giving away anything we shouldn't give away. And if anything's high level to give it away, we want to time it so that the German, if you think of a time stamp, so that the stamp of when the spy sends the information is before it begins, but because of the length of time it takes to make it through the chain of command up into Berlin, it's after it's begun. That way the spy is verified as saying, hey, look out, this is coming, and increases their credibility, and then you can blame the system. Of course, we don't do that. We never blame bureaucracy, okay? And so this is really thought out very, very well, but will it work? This program is called the Double Cross Program. And after cracking Enigma, and the war had begun, Germany dropped 25 spies into Great Britain. The British knew it was 25 because they cracked Enigma. They knew where they were dropped. All 25 were caught. 1 committed suicide who were caught, 15 were imprisoned, 5 were executed, 4 were turned into double agents. 2 were duds. I don't know what your resume has to be a double agent, but they didn't live up to their resume. They were just duds. 2 of them were phenomenal and served throughout the rest of the war. Highly trusted by German intelligence. 1 was a Serbian named Duško Popov, who comes up in the story a lot. Okay? And he was a Serbian playboy. And take that term, playboy, multiply it by 100 and run with it. Okay, this man, he spent a lot of money. He had a lot of relationship adventures. Needed a lot of money. Dressed to the T's in his day. His good friend from Serbia named Jebsen was recruited by the Abwehr and recruited Popov to be an agent for the Abwehr. Well, Popov hated the Nazis, everything about the Nazis, but he also likes his own life. So when he was approached, he agreed for money. He went to the British for money. Got to support his lifestyle. And the British were willing to take a risk. Okay? Now, they still were kind of scratching their head a little bit about this idea of trusting foreign nationals. But folks, you're not going to get a British subject as a foreign agent, as a double agent believed by Germany. So one of the problems for MI5 and MI6 was we're going to have to trust foreign nationals who have no true allegiance to Great Britain at all. What we have to rely on is they have no love of Nazi Germany, that they have the same goal, although the second the war is over, they may not have the same desires. But one thing at a time. So Popov was brought in as a double agent and was very useful, but his lifestyle was a problem. In fact, the British got to be a little concerned that he was on the edge too often. So when Popov went on one trip, he went down to Lisbon, Portugal. Lisbon and Spain were neutral during the war. Has anyone seen Casablanca? Oh yeah. Remember all the planes trying to get out of Casablanca to Lisbon? You get to a neutral area. Well, as it turns out, Lisbon and Spain, etc., those were the hotbeds for double agents, because double agents have to be able to travel to both sides, and you can't do that directly from London to Berlin during the war. So you're going to have to go to Lisbon or Madrid and then across borders and then back. So that's why those countries come up constantly, and Ireland too, come up constantly in these stories. Well, Popov went to Lisbon, and MI5 decided to send an agent to track him because they didn't trust him. And Popov went to a casino. He's a big gambler. And a high-ranking Nazi came in. And Popov decides to challenge him at the gaming tables and bets everything against this Nazi who clearly, if he gives the impression that if he loses, Popov won't have a good night. Okay? But Popov's challenging him anyway. The British agent who was watching Popov, you may have heard of. His name is Ian Fleming. What did he write after the war? James Bond. Guess who was his stereotype in the first book, Casino Royale? Popov. And that lifestyle, doesn't that explain a lot for James Bond? Yeah. If you read or watch Casino Royale, that's the first book, first movie. If you watch, the big scene in the casino is what Ian Fleming watched. Okay? So that's, again, another little rabbit hole. Well, Ian Fleming reported back, by the way, Popov won and lived. Okay? And Ian Fleming said there is no way that a man you can't trust would have gone that far. He's a nut. He's a nut. He's dangerous. We need to be careful. But there's no reason not to trust him with what we choose to tell him. He's being given the chicken food to give to the Germans. Okay? Interesting thing about the Abwehr agents, very few of them, by the way, were Nazis. If you know German history, you realize not everyone in Germany was a Nazi. Very few of the Abwehr were Nazis. Some of them were actively disloyal to Hitler. Some of them were involved in the assassination attempt on Hitler in July 1944, fall of 44. The Abwehr, once they became committed to double agents that were in Britain, they didn't know they were double agents. So the agents that were in Britain didn't want anyone to ever find out if any of the agents were disloyal, because the Gestapo didn't trust Abwehr. And Abwehr didn't trust the Gestapo. And because Abwehr was within the German military, any intelligence units in Abwehr that the Germans didn't trust got sent to the Eastern Front. So if I were a German Abwehr handler and you're my spies, I never want to doubt you. Because if I doubt you, it's bad for me. Okay? But you're demanding more and more money from me. So my game is to say, I want better information from you. When that gets passed up to Britain, Britain's going to have better chicken food. Okay? But as an agent, I want more money you want more money from me. So then Abwehr demanded more money from the system. Germany paid, and Abwehr handlers were getting rich also. They didn't want to lose their gravy train. It isn't until late in the war that the Gestapo really starts to recognize what's happening. And after the war, interviews with people who were captured give us better insight into how all of this just was collapsing around everything. Well, all right, so a couple minute comments there about those spies. So let's get strictly to Operation Fortitude. You have to plan around those perceptions because it didn't work around Torch. So how do we plan around the perceptions? What were German perceptions? First thing was, Germany had spent years building Fortress Europe, the Atlantic Wall. We were very fortunate that in December of 1943, the Japanese ambassador to Berlin took a trip along the Atlantic Wall and recorded what he was seeing and sent that back to Tokyo. Well, because we had broken magic, we are getting firsthand information of what is at the wall. Now, it's going to change 6 months later, but the foundation's already there. See the power of all these spies in breaking the codes. Down here, while this map is up, this dot down here, this is Bordeaux. The Panzers weren't in the city, but the Panzers are in this area down there. That will come up in that desire to keep the Panzers south, okay, so they don't come up into the Normandy area there. All right. Hitler expected the invasion. He expected it in 44. He expected it in July of 44. He expected it here in the Pas de Calais, because it's closest to England. And one of the things all of our spies knew is if someone already believes something, they will believe the lie about it. Because to anyone who already, now this is going to sound odd, just give me a second. To anyone who already believes the lie sounds like the truth. And you're not going to be moved off of understanding the truth because you want to believe the lie. Therefore, the liar doesn't have to worry about being exposed. So the question is, how do we get Hitler to continue believing? That's what he believes. Let's work with it. Okay? Hitler was so sure it was coming in 44 that from that point on, November of 43 on, he did not move any troops from the Western Front to the Eastern Front, even though the Soviets were closing in. That's a pretty significant decision on his part from a military viewpoint. Glad he made it, but a pretty significant decision. There was dissension in the military leadership as they were planning in the spring of 44 to defend against an attack. Some of the German military leadership believed the Panzers should be on the beach so that as the Allies come ashore, we can meet them. That demands which beach? Okay? Others said that Panzers cannot be on the beach. 2 reasons. You don't know which beach, okay? And you want to see what they're bringing and meet them where the Panzers are most useful, which is on an open land area. So the Germans are arguing in the spring of 44. We know that. We want to keep them arguing. That's a good thing from our viewpoint. So let's keep that dissension going. And I've already mentioned the dissension in the German intelligence. We want to use that. So where did the Germans get their information? Well, from wireless intercepts, they would get our radios and other things. They would get that and interpret that. They would get it from air surveillance flying over Great Britain, and of course from the spies. The air surveillance was supposed to catch some of the dummy equipment that was being built, etc. As the war began, as the planning began, that was the assumption. That would be the most important part of the operation. As it turns out, the spies are going to be the most important part. But everything served its role. Fortitude was divided into 2 parts. Fortitude North, which was to look like an attack on Norway, and Fortitude South, which was to handle the coast of France, including Bordeaux. if you're looking at Great Britain and Northern Ireland here, a ghost army was created in Scotland and Northern Ireland. Ghost army because it didn't really exist. It was assigned a name, the British Fourth Army. It was given a commander Hitler feared. Okay? Which, by the way, seemed like, to a degree, a wasted resource, doesn't it? And British military argued over all this. Do we take a guy we need in the field and put him somewhere that's not going to do anything? And others are saying, I guess more abstract, it's going to do a lot. So you can understand these arguments going on in the real world. Well, Thorne is the general who was appointed up there. He had 334 men and 28 officers. And he was to look like an army of 100,000. So his idea was, we're going to get mobile radio trucks and we're going to drive around Scotland sending all these messages out. And they wrote up messages. What units moving where, who's the commander, how many men, when's the drill on what day, at what time. And now and then, if it was a public move, they would have to use some of the 334 men, put them in the right patches, put them out in public, do a drill, and then teach them the script and move them to the next one. So that just in case anyone in the public is there seeing it and knows someone in Europe and writes home, it backs it all up. Because you realize all this falls apart when you don't tend to the little details. That's where the trouble could be. In fact, U.S. troops then were in Northern Ireland. And if you remember, Ireland and Ireland and Great Britain were not really on speaking terms at this point in their relationship. So there was great concern that there were German spies in Ireland which were beyond the reach of the British. There were U.S. forces in Northern Ireland that were supposedly assigned to this ghost army. Thorne was sent to do a highly secret, completely publicly visible inspection of U.S. troops. Is it common for a different nation's military leader to do a deep inspection of another army? No, not a walkthrough, a true inspection. So Thorne did this very secret, very obvious inspection in Northern Ireland. So if it got out from any German spies, it helps feed the system. Okay? There were a couple of dummy airfields that were made. Like I said, all these fake messages sent. There were barges created. Bombing of Norway increased. Just to keep the ruse up in the north. In the south, Operation Fortitude South, here, wants to build on Hitler's fear of an attack on Calais. Now, if we do a close-up here of the area, where England and France are the closest, the city of Calais is up there. You can't really see it well, but it's just sticking up there in the top of the map. So it's not that the city was the target, it's the area was the target. Southern Belgium and that area, for obvious reasons, is closest. Okay? Easy for air support, shorter for the Navy, get more men across, ships go back. And there's a lot of good strategic reasons. Of course, we all know the real target's here, roughly 200 miles to the south. So, we'll just go with the date it happened, not the date they argued it should have happened. On June 6th, how do we keep the Germans in that top box and down by Bordeaux and keep them away from that small rectangle? That was Fortitude's task. Yes, they used dummies, some people taking a picture. They used artificial equipment, fake equipment. Okay. A couple of pictures here. This is looking down on D-Day, not D-Day proper, but after D-Day. All of these ramps that you see leading across the water and the beach up to drier land, each piece there is a separate unit made of concrete and floating equipment and then floating stuff. And if you look out here, all these breakwaters are huge pieces of concrete. How in the world do you hide building these? And here's an interesting question. How do you even hide it from the British? And you're building them in Britain. Part of Fortitude was to close a 10-mile strip of the British coast to all public. They didn't need to close 10 miles, but if you closed 10 miles, you could hide the real building of equipment and also do some fake things in the meantime that looks like other parts of Europe could be attacked. So they closed it so British couldn't get in their own 10-mile area. The people who were charged with building these big concrete structures were told they were building it as infrastructure for use within the United Kingdom. I have no doubt many people went, yeah, right. I have no doubt. But at this point in the war, not a problem. There was a barge that struck. These are fake landing craft. They're made out of great big oil barrels, welded together, and steel rods run through them, and then wooden structures on top of it, and tarps over all of that. Very heavy, very big. Took about 7 days to build each one of these. That's how fast they were working on them. But there was a barge going down a river one time, a British barge, and it ran into one and popped it. Those sailors, maritime sailors, were put in, well, I won't say prison because that sounds too strict. They were held on a military base until D-Day because no one wanted the British public to be out there. It's like in a pub saying, guess what my barge hit last night? You don't want that happening, so they were held. This is looking down at some of the artificial landing craft. These were used for tanks, supposedly. They're not used for any of that, but that's what they were supposed to do, heavy material. 255 artificial landing craft were made so that German reconnaissance could see it. And they're constantly moved, because if you leave them in the same spot all the time, that doesn't look right. As it turns out, in May of 1944, there were very few reconnaissance flights over England from the Germans because they had lost control of the skies. But you didn't know that in January and February when you're beginning to build these. Here's a wooden plane. Now, I suspect, I'm not an infantryman, but I suspect if you get me close to that, I'm going to notice that's fake. Okay? But flying over, maybe it'll be believed. Again, the game is you have to move these around. So when they built an artificial airfield and they had the artificial planes, they had crews that stayed there all the time on the radio sending signals back and forth about I need fuel, I need this training, we need pilots. They had scripts. Okay? When they had a name, they had to remember a fake name, they had to remember to always use their fake name, just in case they're being listened to. Okay? So they would move these around. Here's a better version. Now you can certainly see how driving down a highway or flying over, you might not notice, unless you know exactly what you're looking for in the plane itself, like you're an airman, you might not notice to the average eye. Till you look up here a little bit, and you see that it's canvas over wooden beams, okay? But they would haul these around, they'd tie a truck to them and pull them around backwards, put lights on these, and they'd pull them around backwards at night, so it looked like the plane was moving around the airfield in case the Germans were watching. And you might wonder, well, who in the world did they get to build all of this? There's an opportunity for everyone. Movie set designers and crews were used, both from Hollywood and from London, to build these. This is one of my favorites. Now, I have to admit, at a younger point in my life, when I saw that, this drew my attention to it. But more so, this did. Because I want what they're eating. Okay, I'll give it away. I didn't know those were inflatable when I was a kid. It was like, wow, that's how we got them across the channel. They're light. See, if you leave it to logic, when someone doesn't know what they're talking about, they create their own logic for it. Turns out that all of these dummies built, moved around, lots of manpower behind it, were not as effective as the Allies had hoped because of that lack of German reconnaissance. Wireless transmissions, carefully written, sent by spies, carefully written, all of that fake radio chatter, 138,000 messages sent during the war, artificial, didn't have a big effect, only because if I have a pitcher and I start pouring water in it, there's a limit. That was too much for the Germans to interpret. So the wireless was good, but when it comes to go time, not very effective. By April, May, not very effective. Because go time for Fortitude is April to August of 44. And you might say, August? If D-Day's in June, why August? Remember the goal, keep the reinforcements away. So you have to keep up the threat beyond the day of invasion. Well, what happened? Had to say all that so you can enjoy this part. On June 1st, the Japanese ambassador met with, remember June 6th is the date. Okay. On June 1st, the Japanese ambassador met with Hitler personally in Berchtesgaden and cabled to Tokyo that night. Now, it took us more than that night to interpret it, but we got it before D-Day. Hitler still fully expected the real attack at the Pas de Calais. He had adjusted his thinking because of I failed to mention one ghost army. There was a ghost army put right down here of U.S. forces, led by none other than General Patton. Now, if you know Eisenhower and Patton, there's no love lost. Patton had already besmirched his name publicly by slapping soldiers. And so he was brought to England, and in Eisenhower's mind, his punishment is, you're in charge of an army that doesn't exist. And we need someone with a big mouth to say stuff publicly anyway. Now, folks, wouldn't you say that fits part of Patton's resume? So he actually was a very good choice. Turns out Hitler thought Patton was our most competent commander in the field, not strategist of the big picture, commander in the field. So when Hitler heard Patton was in charge of the 1st U.S. Army Group, okay, which had 150,000 men stationed in southeast England, targeting Calais, he took that seriously. Good choice. Okay, good choice. So there's that other army group there. So when Oshima reports to Tokyo, Hitler expects the real attack at Calais, because that's where Patton is, across from Calais. Okay? Hitler had adjusted his thinking. He expected a simultaneous attack in Norway, okay? A simultaneous attack in Normandy, and one in Bordeaux. Okay, he's thinking, isn't he? You see where our challenge is? He's got all 4 targets on his mind. We need to keep him focused on the other 3. And that's what Hitler did, because that's what Hitler wanted to believe. Plus, what our spies said. We caught them so off guard that on the evening of D-Day, June 5th, Rommel was 500 miles away at his wife's birthday party. German intelligence had told him there's no imminent threat. Where was German intelligence getting its information that there's no imminent threat? From double-cross agents. It wasn't coming yet. Okay? The leader of the 15th Army, which is the large German army in the box near Calais, was out on a multi-day hunting expedition. Is he expecting an attack? No. The German intelligence leader himself was at a spa bathing. The German Navy on June 5th canceled all of its patrols in the English Channel due to bad weather and the German intelligence assessment that no attack was imminent. On the 5th, also, the commander of the Wehrmacht, the German army, which again is technically outside of the Nazi process, and ran German intelligence as well, said no attack is imminent, and reported that to the troops so the troops could stand down that night. It's kind of a day-by-day call on the Germans' part. Not coming tonight, relax. On June 5th, that night, Hitler is girlfriend at that point, and Goebbels were watching movies late into the night and discussing films. Okay? So he wasn't anticipating anything. Of course, that night, ships are sailing. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the double agents are given the message to send to Madrid, to their handlers in Madrid, the Nazi handlers, that the attack is coming, okay, and that it will be at Calais and other sites, but Calais will be a little delayed. Okay. The timing was for 3 o'clock in the morning, because by the time it goes through the system, it would arrive in Berlin after first troops had come ashore. Okay. So the German handlers were told, be on the radio in Madrid at 3 o'clock, we're sending information. As sometimes happened, the handler didn't get up. He didn't wake up till 8 o'clock in the morning. So the message was time-stamped properly, which would be good for our agents' credibility. It wasn't received by the enemy when we wanted them to receive it, but then if you do a head scratcher, maybe that's okay. So they got the information after the battle had already begun. Hitler was not even awakened that morning. He didn't get up till 10 o'clock that morning. And when he got up, he was in a good mood. He believed, this is what's coming. This is what I've been planning for. Okay? Here's the fake stuff. Get ready. The real one's coming at Calais. Okay, so to him, it's all falling right in place. Now, I've always wondered, that sounds like a good story. How do we verify any of that? Well, let's verify it with a couple of things. First of all, on the 9th of June, 3 days after D-Day, one of our agents, named Garbo, because I'll mention his name in just a moment, sent a message that went all the way to the top of the chain, saying that Normandy is a diversion. So we saw that it got to the top. Then the question is, what did the Germans do, right? Okay, it got to the top. Here's what they did. 5 days after D-Day, on June 11th, they moved one panzer unit from Bordeaux to Normandy. Only one. Because they needed the other one to defend against an attack that was never going to happen. On the 1 week later, only one German division from Calais, 1 week later, was moved south. The others were held in place. On the 15th, because you have to start wondering, well, really, 9 days later, you're still, what's going on? Okay, yay. Okay, but you have to wonder. Okay, on the 15th, we captured a German intelligence map that showed Patton's army in the south of England. They had stationed Patton's 1st U.S. Army Group in the south of England, targeting Calais, and on the 15th of June, they still believed it. That's pretty spectacular. On the 15th, also that day, the German panzers were finally moved were ordered to move from Calais to Normandy. And as they started to move, the German high command was arguing and said, no, don't. Go back. Because of that threat at Calais. So that dissension is still an issue. On the 19th of June, Hiroshima reported that the German intelligence knew there were 23 divisions of U.S. troops under Patton still in southeast England. Now think about that. 13 days later. In July, early intercepts showed they still believed Patton's troops were there. Attacks coming in Calais. 7 weeks after D-Day, 4 German divisions are finally moved from Calais to fight, to reinforce Normandy. In Ike's book, The Great Crusade, he says when the Germans moved those troops, they moved them to their defeat. The time that the Allies had had to fight in Normandy without Germany reinforcing the troops gave us the opportunity to crack through the Atlantic Wall. On July 27th, the Germans formally announced to themselves there will be no attack at Calais. It's kind of like getting your umbrella after it stopped raining. On July 29th, to thank Garbo for his early warning, the German intelligence division awarded Agent Garbo part of Double Cross, given chicken food by the British, mostly lies, awarded Garbo the Iron Cross. He reported back to Berlin, thank you, and also reported that there were many others involved in helping serve the cause. Most of his sub-agents were fictional, including an angry group of Aryan Welshmen, about 6 of them, who were going to overthrow England's government. But if you want to believe angry Aryan Welshmen, you do, don't you? So Germany did. A lot of this information was known about the dummy equipment, etc., but a lot about the spies was not known until more recently, for understandable reasons. There have been a lot of books written from the 1980s and the 1990s, including some by the spies. By the way, Popoff wrote a book about his exploits. MI6's official comment is, there's something in there that's true, but most of it's not. Okay. So I haven't read it. Okay. Because if I want to read Ian Fleming, I'll just read him. He'll tell you up front, no, it's not true. Enjoy. Okay. So there might be some information out there for you to chase that you hadn't heard before, because a lot of it now is declassified since it was intelligence, and the actors are no longer there, so they can release the stories of the agents. Okay? I have this quote I'd like to read you as I wrap it up here. The author of one of the books about the double-cross agents made this statement, but he also said multiple times in the book, under no circumstances does what these agents accomplished, which was his focus, take away from, belittle, or try to equal the sacrifice of the men on the ground. Okay, so when I read this, please don't think that the author is missing where the real work was. Here's his statement. Those who fought on the battlefront of D-Day never knew that a Polish patriot, a Peruvian gambling girl, a French dog lover, a Serbian playboy, and a Spanish chicken farmer, together and in the deepest secrecy, had lied them to victory. I'm thankful because 2 of my uncles served in Normandy. They were not there on D-Day. So it's the work of Double Cross after D-Day that contributed to them coming home. On the left, Uncle Burl, they're brothers. On the right, Uncle Bert. And those of you know military information in D-Day, they had no idea each other was even in France. They were walking through a field in France. You know how sometimes bands, they walk through each other's lines? Well, they were in 2 different units, and they were going 2 different places. And in this field of France, Uncle Bert, on the right, was just marching where he was supposed to march, and all of a sudden someone whacked him on the head on his helmet, and he turned and looked, and it's his brother. You know, it's a small world. You never know where you're going to run into somebody. Okay? And they both saw combat. Neither one of them would discuss that. They would only talk about that story. And meeting in Paris after the German surrender and having this picture taken. Okay? I want to thank you all for having me here today. I really am honored and humbled by it. Here's a couple of sources if you'd like to look at these. Don't forget Casino Royale. and various other books and things. There's lots of stuff out there. I just chose a couple here. Thank you all very much. Have a great day.
Mark, in our education terms, you get an A+ for today. That was outstanding. Thank you for being with us. We do have a brief photo montage interlude at this point that Susan's preparing the computer. The museum has put together a wonderful compilation of photos and a few personal letters from Audie that were read during oral interviews conducted in the 1970s. A special thanks goes to Kristen for putting these together. So momentarily we'll have that going for you.
Happy Christmas, Grandpa. And Sylvester J. Hoffman, Box 104. Celeste, Jim Parker, and all. Just like to say how you all, and see how you're getting along. I am fine and have been very busy lately going to school. Also want to tell you that I'm going to get a new Winchester automatic and am trying to get one more. I think I'll be able to, so we can go hunting when I come home. Don't know a lot of news to write. Tell Mr. Davis, Pete Hudson, Aunt Nora, and everyone hello from me. Hope Mom and Grandma are feeling okay. I don't know when I'll get home. Possibly in October, I hope. Anyway, I still think I can beat you killing some girls. What do you think? 30 for now. Love to all, as always, always. This is Germany, April 1st, 1945. There's from all over, from Italy, from France. Oh, goodness. I didn't say, all of them, but you just don't think to at that time, do you? Dear folks, hello everyone. Just a few lines to say hello and let you know that I'm still okay. Here's hoping you are all well. Did I tell you that I have been awarded the DSC and the Silver Star and the Bronze Star, and I already had a Purple Heart and 2 Oak Leaf clusters, and now I'm back at the regional headquarters waiting for them to give me the CMH so I can come home. And also to receive the Legion of Merit pretty soon, since that is all the medals they have to offer. I'll take it easy for a while. Ha ha. Mom, if you don't know what all this means, show it too. Has a victim? He's a victim, he will tell you. How's Grandma getting along these days? Tell her hello from me. Will you also tell everyone else hello that I know around there, and that I hope to see all of you soon, as I don't know much news to write this time. I'm a better sign, 30 for now, so be good and write often. Love to all, Audie. This is Germany, April 1st. Now that I don't think it's handwriting. August the 9th, 1946. His handwriting is separate. What kind of handwriting? Dear Mom, just a note to say hello and let you know that I have not forgotten you. I have been working awfully hard going to school almost day and night. Don't know exactly when I will get to come home. I will bring my gun for Barbara to keep for me when I come, and sending a couple of extra photos that you can give to someone if you want to. Love to all. Now, was your husband the barber? Oh,
Everyone called him Barbara John. That's all I ever knew.
And that's the reason this one is addressed to Dear Barbara and all. Dear Barbara and all. And this one is Italy, June the 19th. 46, I guess. Dear folks, just a line to say hello. Hope you're all well. I am fine. Things are pretty quiet here now. Have been to Rome twice. We'll try to send you a couple of little gadgets from Rome. I guess Johnny is in France by now. Wish I were there too. Tell Robert he better get a head start on what does it say? On a family. On a family. Because I may catch up with him when I get home. Ha. How's Big John? Hope he is well. Sure hope Granddad is better by now. Well, little Mom, there isn't much to write just now, so we'll sign 30 for now, and to send love.
Well, was Audie with you when you barbecued that rabbit that night, Farmer?
Let's see. I guess it was.
I think so.
I remember when I barbecued rabbit for somebody.
I think it was him. You took brick and made a little furnace, and you and the boys got out and barbecued that rabbit. I never even They did.
I guess you said, I can't remember.
Probably him and Johnny Bill Cochran and Monroe and
Susan, you're preparing the next video for us. As she's doing that, I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker. And before I give you the official introduction that I've been presented with, I was fortunate to have dinner with them Thursday evening, and I'm going to give this guy a title. He is Living Life Full Throttle. he just is an amazing person. So here's the introduction I was given. Recently, a magazine story about our next guest had the following headline: Scarlett O'Hara cuddled him, Marilyn Monroe caressed him, Linda Evans proposed to him, and Raquel Welch went ahead and married him. Ho Chi Minh shot him down, and 34 years later, he met the lovely Annabelle that has captured his heart. But most importantly today, in this venue, his friend was Audie Murphy. Who is this guy? Ladies and gentlemen, Patrick Curtis.
Hi, I've met some of you, and I hope to meet the rest of you a little bit later. Audie was my friend. People wonder how that all happened. Well, Audie's about 13 years older than I am. So when he was just arrived in Hollywood, I was a young kid. I was an actor. You all are my favorite folks. You all have gray hair. So you remember the Ma and Pa Kettle movies? Okay, I was one of the 19 kids. As I grew older, I was a little bit bigger and bigger. And one day, handsomest guy I'd ever seen in my life walked up to me at Universal Studios and said, hey kid, where's the film place? And I said, well, what do you mean? Anyway, to make a long story short, Audie Murphy and Hugh O'Brien, who were young contract players before this young guy, it had happened to them. Somebody sent them out looking for a left-handed can of film, which doesn't exist. So here's this 11-year-old kid talking to this, movie star one day, and I said, listen, I don't think there is such a thing as a left-handed can of film. So we went back to the gym, Frankie Band's gym, and Audie Murphy and Hugh O'Brien were in there working out. And so my new friend thought, well, I'm going to choose one of them off. And he thought, well, not Audie Murphy because he's a highly decorated. So he chose the other guy, Hugh O'Brien. He didn't realize Hugh O'Brien in World War II was the youngest drill instructor in the Marine Corps. So I never did find out what happened, but I met Audie. This was before he was a neighbor. About a year later, he moved into our neighborhood in Toluca Lake. Now, Toluca Lake to this day is a magic place. When I was a child, Frank Sinatra lived across the street. Bob Hope lived around the corner, and their daughters and I went to grammar school together. So it really was fabulous, and we were friends to this day. So around the corner and down the way a few blocks, or a few houses, was Audie Murphy's, and he would invite his kids over and pay us 10 cents a mouse to hunt mice in his barn. Now, didn't care much about that so much with our BB guns, but his wife Pamela made the best tuna sandwiches you ever had. So we knew that if we were there, we could get a tuna sandwich and at least a couple dimes, so it was a pretty good deal. My father ran Republic Studios, so all of you who have ever seen a Roy Rogers movie or a John Wayne movie or a John Wayne war film or whatever, most of them were at Republic Pictures. And my dad ran it. He didn't own it, he ran it for Herbert J. Yates. But because of that, I worked a lot as a kid at Republic, and I knew a lot of people. Yakima Canutt, the greatest stuntman in the world, taught me how to ride, so I could ride like the wind. Later on today, we're going to show a movie that I made called Meanwhile Back at the Ranch. My wife said I made the movie to put me in it, but it's not true. I just happened to be there, riding like the wind looking for Wild Bill Elliott, so it just happened to be. Anyway, so Audie would come over and play cards, and with people, I look back on Clark Gable, Jimmy Stewart, people like that were playing cards at our house every Saturday. And somehow or another, Audie won a rifle, a Mossberg double-barrel shotgun that was over our chimney in the playroom, and he won the gun, but he didn't win it from my father because my father wasn't there, and somehow it got traded for a horse, and somehow the horse ended up being mine. And I never was quite sure how that all happened to this day. I don't know. I know, but it was a 2-year-old Palomino called Golden Rule, and it was the worst horse that ever lived in the history of horses. And now, as I mentioned, Yakima Canutt, the greatest stuntman in the world, taught us kids how to ride, and I modestly was a pretty darn good rider. I would get on that horse, he would buck me into the Eddie River on my ass every time. And Audie and my dad and other people would ride with me to see what I was doing wrong, and that horse was in the Rose Parade. I mean, we were just nothing. But once they were gone, bam, into the river again. So, but Audie was just a super guy to us. Now, we all know Audie was not very big. And by the time a lot of us were like 11, 12, 13 years old, we're the same size as Audie was, you know. So he was one of the guys, and he was so kind to us kids. He never really talked much about the war to us. I think, you know, we all know about PTSD. We didn't know then. It was shell shock. My dad was in the war. My uncles was in the war. My dad, who was good friends with Audie, when he came home from the war, I was about 3 when he left, so I was 7, almost 8 years old when he got home in 1946. Audie hadn't arrived in Hollywood yet, but my dad came home. Came in the front door, there was a big good-looking stranger in his uniform and his duffel bag over his shoulder, and he walked in the door. My mother was upstairs, and he walked in, shook my hand, handed me a quarter, said, "Patrick, go to the movies." Okay, Dad. I went to not unusual. It's kids our age, we went to the movies. A lot of us were little kids, you know. So I went to the movies, and you know, when I came home, my sister was born 9 months and 38 minutes after he gave me the quarter, you know. so it took me a hell of a long time to figure that one out, but when I did, I went, oh my goodness, you know, I was a grown man. I thought, son of a gun, you know. My sister doesn't like that story at all, so I tell her a lot, you know, just, Patrick, don't tell me. My lovely wife, Annabelle, people say, what was my favorite weapon? And I always say napalm. And she says, don't say that, it's terrible. So the women in my life have told me not to say things, and I pay no attention at all. It works out real well. Anyway, I'm so pleased to be here. It's hard for me to look back on and realize that, you know, what a wonderful guy Audie was to all of us. Now, I was, as you heard, I was married to a lovely lady named Raquel Welch. I don't remember any of it, of course, because my wife's here. But one of the first interviews that she had was to be in an Audie Murphy movie. And I remember going with her to the studio, and there was Audie, who remembered me. I hadn't seen him in quite a while, and you know, we had a great time talking. She wasn't really in a position to say yay or nay, anything. She was just a really young, just starting actress. And Audie and the producer wanted her to play an Indian, and she said, I don't want to play Indians. I said, I'm not an Indian. I don't want to play an Indian, and so she didn't. Years later, when she became a major movie star, she played an Indian 3 different times, you know, so, for a whole lot of money. I think Audie was going to give her $10,000. $10,000 is $10,000, but anyway, so she played an Indian 3 different times, did real well, I thought so. And I had the Night Passage movies that somebody saw last night with Jimmy Stewart and Audie. Jimmy Stewart, we made a movie in Del Rio, Texas called Bandolero with Raquel, Dean Martin, and Jimmy Stewart. And Andy McLaglen directed, did a lot of John Wayne movies, wonderful director. And so we were in Del Rio, Texas, at a Howard Johnson's, not like the nice Howard Johnson here, but it was kind of old and dilapidated. So the Faded Roses of Texas learned that Jimmy Stewart was having dinner at the Howard Johnson every night, and they would come by the hordes, you know, they pull in. And Jimmy, you're looking so old, you're so thin, boy, I gotta take you out to the ranch and show you the Jimmy Joe Bob. And, you know, and we would try to protect him, you know, and it got to the point where we would throw Howard Johnson rolls at these ladies. And they were like a grenade, you know. And this one lady asked everybody if they would sign her roll, and they did. So she's probably still got it, you know. Anyway, so y'all know Del Rio? Okay, across the border, for those of you, right across the border is Ciudad Acuña. And inside Ciudad Acuña is a little place, called Boys Town. I don't know why, but it's called Boys Town. Inside Boys Town, there was a really, really good Mexican restaurant called Ricardo's. And it had wonderful food. So every once in a while, we'd all go down to Ricardo's. Now, everybody had their wives. Jimmy Stewart had Gloria, and Dean Martin had Jeannie, and everybody had their wives, or in my case, husband. And we would go. It was a really good restaurant with a bordello up above. And along the sides of the room were lovely young ladies in short shorts and a satin jacket. There was one fellow who was not married. He was a bachelor, and his name was Andy Prine. And I know if you saw him, you'd recognize him. He's been in a million westerns, tall, slender, good, wonderful actor. So he was the only bachelor. So unbeknownst to him, Jimmy Stewart slipped the maitre d' some money, who sort of handed it out to the girls, and they came over and just bothered the hell out of poor little Andy Prine. They said, now they could steal your socks without taking your shoes off, these girls. So they would sit in his lap, and he didn't know what was going on, and the women that, you know, and Jimmy would hand the guys some more money, and they'd go to unzip their little jackets, and Andy would dig in his pocket and give them money to not do it, so they're making out like a bandit for doing nothing, you know, heck of a job. So anyway, so Jimmy Stewart was the best, but he had a sense of humor. And I had an opportunity to tell you that. I hadn't thought about it for a long time, but he was a hell of a guy and a good friend of mine. I was the president of the Vietnam Veterans Leadership Program under President Reagan, and we did a lot of good for the veterans in the early 80s. We raised a lot of money, did a lot of really good things, and Jimmy was one of those guys. The World War II vets were so good to the Vietnam vets, to the Jimmy Stewarts, the Tony Curtises, the Robert Stacks, Glenn Ford. I could call them and say, listen, we got to raise some money in Des Moines, or an event next Saturday, will you come? They'd get on the plane and we'd go. And I went a lot of places with Jimmy, and he was just a super guy. And Audie, you know, our paths crossed, and we come back together, and they crossed, and we come back together. But as a kid, he was the best darn neighbor. Frank Sinatra wasn't bad either, because he had a good-looking daughter, but that's another story. But and Audie's kids, you know, he had two wonderful little boys. They were quite a bit younger than we were, even though we were pretty young, and I got to know them a little bit. They were my brother's age, so my brother would, you know, play with them, I guess. Sinatra's side of the street on Valley Spring Lane, all the people that lived there, their backyard was a beautiful lake. That's why it's called Lakeside. And so we called that the rich side of the street. And our side of the street, we called the poor side. So our backyard was Lakeside Country Club, so it wasn't too poor, you know. And about 5 doors down from our house was Amelia Earhart's house. Now, she had disappeared before I was born, but the house is still there, a beautiful cut glass a mirror above the fireplace with their continents on it, with their, aviatrix gear and everything. It's still exactly the same. I'm sure it's been bought and sold many times, but people have upgraded the house. I'm sure the kitchen and stuff, but the house itself is exactly the same. So, anyway, I'm so pleased to be here. Later on in the day, we're going to show a movie I made called Meanwhile Back at the Ranch, as I mentioned, and we'll have some question and answer, and I think we'll all have some good times. Don't sit on your hands. If you have a question, please ask me. Not now, but a little later on. And if you ask me about, I don't remember anything about Raquel at all. But between now and then, I may, or I'll send Anvil out for something and we can talk.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. He's a great guy and lots of fun, as you'll learn this afternoon and spending more time with him. Our second speaker today, we're so proud that you're here with us, a retired attorney with a BS and MS degree from Cal Poly San Leo's. Thank you. We'll leave it at that. An MBA and a doctorate of jurisprudence degrees from UCLA. As an attorney in Southern California, her practice included contract and entertainment law. Larryann and her husband Porter owned and operated PW Livestock for over 45 years, specializing in quarter horses and beef cattle. In 1984, Porter supplied horses for the Clint Eastwood movie Pale Rider and became good friends with movie wrangler Jay Fishburne. Jay had been a personal friend of Audie Murphy's and was still close to the Murphy family. In 1995, A&E Entertainment approached the Murphys about doing an Audie Murphy biography. Jay asked Larryann if she would represent the family pro bono in the contract negotiations. That was the beginning of a long and ongoing friendship between her and Terry Murphy. Together they formed the Audie Murphy Research Foundation, dedicated to finding and preserving information about Audie and making it available to the public through audiemurphy.com. Today she'll be talking about her new book, Audie Murphy Undercover, that was just published. Please join me. Let's welcome Larryann Willis.
It's so good to be here. I was actually at the Cotton Museum, I believe it was 96, a long time ago. Terry and I came down. I guess he didn't come with me to the Cotton Museum. He had to go home, but I stayed in Texas, and I went to Louisiana, where I interviewed Nathan Durham, and got to know so many wonderful people here. And when Terry and I first met, well, let me back up a little bit. My husband and I were big Audie Murphy fans, just like you guys. We knew he was a World War II hero, and my husband had served in the military during Vietnam. And in fact, I have a really interesting story. It doesn't have to do with Audie, but it has to do with the World War II boys. When we were living in Germany, compliments of Uncle Sam, we were both horse people and into horses, and I found a horse to ride. So I went over there, I'd been teaching school, and I went over in my dress to hold the horse, And the farm woman comes out and says, "You're not going to hold the horse in those clothes, are you?" And I go, "Yeah." Well, found out what she was talking about, because in Germany, when you hold the horse, you hold the feet up. And the blacksmith gets on his knees, faces the horse, and has a mallet and a knife, and goes around like that. So there I was in my dress with a skirt, with this horse, Anyway, it turns out that this blacksmith fought against the Americans on the German side. And he, unlike a lot of the German people that didn't like Hitler, they fought for Germany because they didn't want to get shot by the SS. This guy was really pro-Nazi. And he said, they showed us these films of the American troops getting off the planes. These are the guys we're going to go fight. They were mussed up. Their boots weren't polished. These were 90-day wonders. They were right off the farm, and they didn't even know how to salute. And he said it was just going to be a piece of cake. And then he said, we met him, you know, on the battlefront. And he said, everybody knows the way you fight a war is you shoot the officers. Because if you shoot the officers, you have to regroup and establish a new chain of command. Because if the wrong person gives a command, they could be executed. So nobody's going to give a command, you know, unless you've been properly appointed in that position. So we get out there and we start shooting the officers, and some private would stand up, hey, they shot Joe and they just attack us. He said, they didn't listen to the officers anyway. He said, we didn't know what to do. He said, we never fought people like that. And I kind of think the British might have had the same problem with the Americans when, during the Revolutionary War, those squirrel guns hiding in the bushes, that's not the way you fight a war. Well, apparently the Germans were confronted with the same thing. But I digress. It's just with that first wonderful presentation, I had to say something. I thought when I was going to meet Terry, loved Jay, he told us wonderful stories about Audie, and he was just a great person. In fact, Terry was telling me the day before I came down here how much he loved Jay. I thought, well, gosh, maybe before I meet Mr. Murphy, I should try to find out a little bit more about his father. So I went down to the library and started pulling up magazines and everything, and, you know, reading about his film career. And I read To Hell and Back, and then I pulled up a Time magazine. And there was a little section in there, and it was right after Audie had been killed. And it was a quote from Mr. Ed Parton, who was the union boss of the Baton Rouge Teamsters. So he was the business manager for the Baton Rouge Teamsters. And he said, was calling for a thorough investigation of the plane crash because Audie Murphy was an undercover investigator in organized crime. And he thought there was, you know, that there was something really screwy about this. And I went, what? You know, I'd never heard anything like that, and it was the only time I've ever seen it. So I went and visited with Terry, and we got to know each other, you know, better as the time went on. And finally I got around to asking him, I said, you know, I saw this thing from Ed Parton that said your dad was investigating organized crime. And he said, yeah, I know. And I said, how come I haven't ever heard about this? He said, well, nobody would believe it. If you came out and told anybody that my dad was doing this, they'd go, yeah, right, it's a publicity stunt or something. But he said that he knew Frank Ronick really well, who was an investigator for the Los Angeles DA's office, specializing in organized crime. And Frank had hung out at the house as long as Terry had, you know, could remember. He was there really when he was born, and he was just always around. And they were always discussing law enforcement. At first it was mostly about narcotics. His dad really was after drug dealers. And Art Strong, who was the narcotics investigator in Tucson, Arizona, said that Audie told him that he had a niece who died of an overdose while he was in World War II. I have never been able to track down any such niece, but apparently Audie told that to more than one person. It might have been an acquaintance or somebody, but she had OD'd, I think it was on heroin, and Audie was just death on people that dealed it. So anytime he had a chance, he would assist. He would, I guess you'd call it undercover, people knew who he was, but he would go out and buy drugs and then turn the names over to Frank, and Frank would go out and arrest him. In fact, Terry told me he had a rock band as he got older. Terry was 19 when his dad was killed. He had long hair, you know, you gotta have long hair if you're in a rock band. It just irritated Audie. And Audie comes in one day, and he did use some four-letter words pretty frequently. I mean, after all, he was a soldier. He came in and told Terry, he says, if you're going to have that goddamn long hair, at least you could be useful. Come with me. It takes Terry out to do some undercover narcotics buys. And they reported it to Frank. And Frank said, I was in my 20s before I realized that other families didn't live like that. You know, that wasn't what other people did. So he knew a lot about what his dad had done, you know, in regards to law enforcement, but he didn't know it all. And he told me that I just always thought that Frank would be there. He was just always there. And all of a sudden, 8 years after Audie had been killed, Frank dropped dead of a massive cerebral hemorrhage. And it really kind of freaked Terry out because he just always felt that Frank was there to fill in the holes. He really needed to know this information. And then, of course, Don Graham wrote his book, which wasn't very kind to Audie. And among the things, I mean, he kind of alluded to Audie being on the wrong side of the track, shall we say, and getting, you know, he was involved in gambling, and he was sort of on the shady side, kind of on the edge, which really irritated me and really irritated Terry a great deal. So Terry decided that maybe we should go ahead and try to really get serious about finding out what his dad was doing, but where do you start? And we knew that he worked with all these officers, but we didn't know who they were. Steve Bronick was still alive, and that was Frank Bronick's son, and we got a hold of him, and he directed us to Clayton Anderson. So we went out and visited with Clay. Clay was wonderful, just the most wonderful person. We spent 2 days with Clay, recorded all this information, and I kind of wrote it up, and then Clay reworked it and everything, and he signed it as a statement about Audie Murphy that I present in the book. But he was Audie Murphy's boss. He was in charge of the DA's Organized Crime and Narcotic Division for Los Angeles County. And he also worked, you know, in coordination with the FBI and, you know, Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Customs, all of those places. And Audie worked for him. He said it was highly important to keep his identity totally secret. And I said, well, everybody knew who Audie was, you know. I mean, he was a movie star. He said, exactly. That's why he was such a terrific undercover agent. Everybody, even mafia members, wanted to meet him. So he could get in and see virtually anybody that he wanted to. And so he purposely cultivated this image of being a little on the shady side. Because if they thought he was Mr. Goody Two-Shoes, those guys weren't going to trust him. And the really great thing about it, as far as Audie was concerned, I mean, he liked to gamble, let's face it. Even in his book, To Hell and Back, he talks about gambling, how many birds landed on a wire, you know. It was just one thing after another. But it was so cool because he got to place all these illegal bets. And the nice thing about placing illegal bets is bookies don't report what you win to the IRS. So you don't have to pay taxes on it. And it was legal for him to do it because the DA's office knew he was doing it because he was their agent. So if he got arrested, he was good. So this was just terrific as far as he was concerned. And the way it worked, according to Clayton, to protect the informant, or he wasn't an informant, he was a full-blown agent. I guess I need to clarify that. As a layperson, I'm going, informant, agent, what's the difference? Well, there's a big difference. An informant is a bad guy that got caught. Alyssa would know this. And so they trade information in order to get a lighter sentence or no sentence at all. Well, Audie was a full-blown agent that had been sent in on assignment, and he actually worked for them. but it was a total secret because he was dealing with really bad guys. I mean, these guys would kill you. And they had to keep his identity secret because if it ever got out, he was in serious trouble. So Clayton identified him by a number, and they had a list of agents that worked for the DA's office, and the only person that knew it was the DA for the chief, and he had a list with their names and their number, and he kept it in a safe that only he had the combination to. And when they brought cases, the agents were identified by number. And he said, we did not want Audie or any of these agents to testify in court, because once they did, their cover was blown. And not only was it in a safe, but they could never work for us again. So he said, when I retired and left, I took that list out and destroyed it. I'm the only one that knows this list of people. He says that I can't remember Audie's number. It's been so many years. Otherwise, we could pull up these cases and identify him by the number. But he was able to identify several people that Audie worked with, which was really a good start. And so Terry and I started contacting all these people. And what we felt that there was a lot of research we could do. And bless your hearts, all these people that helped the Audie Murphy Research Foundation, they sent us so much valuable information, documents, books, pictures, just wonderful things, but we decided we better not focus on that because a whole bunch of Audie's personal friends have already passed away. And we better use all our energy in trying to find these people and record their recollections. So that's what we did, and that's why I was down here. We went out and visited Monroe, Hackney, and Martha Hackney, and Nadine, and Billy, and Eugene, everybody that we could find. And then we traveled, like I said, I went to Louisiana, and I interviewed Nate Durham, a customs agent that I worked with, and I interviewed Doug Parton, Ed Parton's brother, who was there during all of this work involving Ed Parton. Now, how many people here have read the book? Very many? Okay, so a lot of you don't know what's in the book. Okay. Well, Audie was very, very close friends with Sheriff Bill Decker, who was the famous chief of police for Dallas. Not chief of police, sheriffs for Dallas. And Audie was a deputy for actually, Decker. Audie was down there because him and Wanda were on their honeymoon. Audie went in and visited Decker, who had just been elected as sheriff like the month before. And Decker decided to present him with a special deputies thing, a picture taken, good publicity. And Decker didn't realize that he got a deputy. I mean, Audie said, here I am reporting for work. Well, it turns out that, and he even told Spec McClure this, that he had always been interested in law enforcement and really wanted to be a Texas Ranger. That's what he wanted to do, rather than go in the movie business. But, he got in the movie business, and how can you turn down 2 movies a year, $125,000 a movie, work about 4 months, and the rest of the time, this, you're off. So it gave Audie a chance to go do what he really wanted to do, which was a lot of law enforcement work. And he spent a great deal of time in Dallas with Decker, became very close friends, and went out on patrol, with the sheriff's officers. And the one man was still alive that Audie patrolled with all the time, and that's Bill Wiseman. And Terry and I came down here and we spent an entire day with Bill. He was driving a car and we drove all the way around, all over with his wife. He said, well, here was where Audie decked this guy, and here was where this. this one story I just love, and I keep repeating it. He says, "Oh, this intersection, this car sailed off the road. It was a rainy night. It was really muddy, and the car sailed off the road. The headlights were on, and the engine was going. And we decided we better go down there and investigate. If somebody had a heart attack or something." They go down there, and he said it looked like a cartoon. He said the wheels were going round and round, and the mud was flying straight up. What the heck? So they go up to the window and knock on the window, and this guy, drunk as his stuff, rolls his window down and says, "Hey, Sheriff, how are you keeping up with me?" And Bill says, "This guy has got to go in." He shines the flashlight across the car, and there's this bar floozy over there, really overweight, and she's passed out in the other seat. So he tells Audie, and Audie says was a really good sport. He had these beautiful lizard skin boots that were worth a fortune, and he was always dressed up so nice with 10X silver belly, Stetson hat. Audie, he just ignores his nice clothes, and walks over there, and he says, "Well, you go get the woman. I'm going to take this old boy up and put him in the car. You go get the woman, bring her up, and we'll take him in." He gets up there and stashes the guy, and Audie's nowhere around. He goes, "What the hell?" He hollers at him, "Where's Audie, Audie?" No Audie. So he goes down there to try to find him. Well, what had happened is this gal weighed well over 300 pounds. And she got out and stood up and fell on him and drove him into about 6 inches of mud, and her breasts were over his face. And he was literally suffocating. She was out cold. So Bill said she wasn't easy to roll off. He had to pry Audie out of the mud, and he said, "Oh God, he was just mud from head to toe." So we went in and put these people in jail, and he took off. It was a little off color, but you know how cops are. The next evening, Audie comes into work, and all the cops are going, "Hey, Audie, we hear you got laid last night." I mean, there's just all kinds of wonderful cop stories, and every single cop, police officer, investigator that we worked with, I would say that, well, Don Graham said this, and some other people, when it was alluded to that he did some police officer work, well, he was just out playing cop. He was an actor. He was just playing. And they get so mad. It was a real thing. How can you say that? And Durham said he spent 2 days on, laying in a ditch with me, spying on these investigators, working his butt off, and it was raining, and it was a mess. And I'm sitting there thinking, what in the world is he doing out here with me, And he said he was just a great American that just felt he had a duty. And he felt, they all said that Audie had never changed. He really had this patriotic feeling of helping America and bringing the bad guys to justice. He also was sort of an adrenaline junkie, I think. In fact, Audie had a problem with depression, and he had discovered that if he did something like ride a racehorse, which he did, and a couple of owners to ride races, or got in a shootout or a fist fight, it gave him an adrenaline high. And he wasn't depressed for several days. And then later, I was doing some research on depression, and it says that most of the antidepressants are based on adrenaline chemistry. So apparently he had discovered a way to self-medicate. And when he started getting depressed, he went and did something exciting. And one of those exciting things was to go after the mafia. Well, anyway, he was extremely close to Sheriff Bill Decker, Bill Wiseman, Harry Weatherford, all these guys in the Texas Sheriff's Department. He was out promoting a movie when the president was assassinated, so he wasn't here. But all of his friends were right smack in the middle of it. Bill Wiseman was the first one in the Texas book depository. Harry Weatherford's the one that found the infamous picture of Oswald with the rifle. And he actually is the one that tracked Oswald to his house. Another one was involved in the arrest of Oswald after he murdered Tippis. So these guys were all really involved. And it was chaos. There was friction, at least on the Dallas Police Department side, toward the Sheriff's Department. There was kind of this territorial dispute of who was in charge. And Decker just backed off. He said, you guys just go ahead and handle it. And he had the jail. And his jail was highly secure. So they were supposed to be moving Oswald to the jail. I think we all know what happened. And Decker got a call from the FBI saying that they'd been informed that Oswald was going to be killed. So Decker called the Dallas police and said, you better move him in secret. I'm going to send Bill Wiseman, Audie's buddy, over to, I guess it's called pull a chain, where they get a bunch of prisoners together and they all handcuff them to a chain and they go, and that way it'll look like a routine transport and we'll get him moved. Well, the chief of police said, well, we promised the press that we'd do it in public so that they could get all these pictures. And Decker says, weren't you told that by the FBI that there's going to be a hit on him? And they said, well, we know what we're doing. Well, we all know that they didn't know what they were doing. But Decker, well, let's put it this way. They moved Ruby in secret after that. Decker didn't know what he didn't know. He was suspicious of absolutely everybody. And at first, right after the assassination, he thought, well, in that case, we caught this guy in that case shooting out of the window. That's probably what happened. He just got lucky. Well, then Jack Ruby assassinated Oswald, and Decker had a really long file on Jack Ruby. And he knew about Jack Ruby's affiliations with organized crime. And right away, Decker says, I don't know what's going on, but this smells like organized crime. And we need to investigate it. But he didn't trust the Dallas police after this whole thing of, we're not going to protect Oswald. And Decker decided that he would pretend like he's not investigating and just let the police department and the FBI and CIA and everybody was down there, and he's just staying out of it. But he's actually following up leads with the connections that Jack Ruby had with organized crime. In fact, Decker had a tape recording of the previous sheriff talking about the Chicago Mafia offering him bribes through Jack Ruby to let them operate in Dallas without being harassed. And Jack Ruby was right in the middle of that. So Decker was convinced that there was an organized crime connection. He also, feeling that, was worried about his own safety and that of his own men. Because these people, if they did, in fact, kill the president, they weren't going to be bothered by a sheriff that was getting too close or too nosy. So Decker actually flew out to Los Angeles, and he met with Audie and Frank Roberts and, not Frank Roberts, but Ronick, and his associate, Mr. Ween, at the time, in a cafeteria at the LA Police Department, and he said that I need to have somebody that has the information that I'm digging up they can keep it safe somewhere where no one will see it. And I want to send it out to you, to Audie. And he had a safe that he was keeping all the stuff that Decker sent him. And I'd like for you guys, he says it's asking a lot, but you work organized crime, to do what you can from your end while we're working our end. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail because the book's 350 pages. So Audie was following up on leads. Now Terry's telling me, oh, they're never going to believe it, you know, that all these people have all these theories on JFK. I said, well, we're not talking about the theories. Your dad was one of hundreds of law enforcement officers that were following up leads. He never solved anything, but he was working undercover pursuing leads. And they never declared who did it or, you know, anything like that. He was just one of the undercover people that was really going out of his way to work and find it. And then a few years later, a bookie that Audie really liked and bet with was murdered in his house. And it turns out, they couldn't prove it, that the murder was Fifi Bussieri, who was the head assassin for the Chicago Mafia, San Diego County. And Audie was furious about it because these were friends of his, and he was determined to bring Bussieri down. And I don't know if you guys have heard about it. Everybody seems to find the notorious FBI file, which is about this thick. And when I ordered it years ago, it took me over a year to get it. And, oh yeah, about 50% of it's nothing but blacked out lines, you know. And what you see in there is Audie Murphy placing bets with the Mafia. And making comments, you know, about police officers he didn't like, and this guy and that guy, and he seems like kind of a bad person. Well, there were a whole lot of names blanked out, and among them was Frank Ronick's name was blacked out. Clayton said, oh, Frank's name is in there. But he was still alive, and anybody that was still alive, you couldn't have in the public records. So there were a lot of people that Audie was working with that are blacked out. So what's left is Audie Murphy sounding like a really bad guy. He turned this evidence that he got on Fifi Bussieri over to the LA County DA's Office for Prosecution, and David Nissen brought a case against Fifi Bussieri. Audie was the only witness, and they never were able to make a case against Fifi because people were either afraid to testify or wound up dead. Well, you weren't going to back Audie off, and he was so angry about what happened to Bobby Rolstad and his wife Suzanne that he decided it was worth, he was thinking about getting out of the undercover business because it was getting pretty dangerous because of all the organized crime people he was going after, and he had a family. And he decided that exposing Bussieri and putting him away was worth giving up being an agent. And so he agreed to testify against Fifi Bussieri. And I believe that the trial was set for October. At that point, the grand jury and people didn't know who the secret witness was. He would appear at the hearing, or at the trial. But then Clayton Anderson intervened and said, wait a minute, Audie's working on another really serious investigation, and he needs a couple more months to finish that. And once we finish that, then we're gonna go ahead and do Bussieri. Well, this other thing was he had got a line on a way into the Marcello crime family in New Orleans. And Ruby was hooked in with them and had made calls to, and so had Oswald, to members of this crime family. And the problem with the Marcello crime organization is nobody could get in. If anybody was the least bit suspect, they were either kicked out or dead. And they've never been able, the FBI, nobody had been able to get anybody on the inside of that family. Well, there was a guy named Dalton Smith that was a con man who was unbelievable, who laundered mob money. And he had this really cool con going. I won't go into the details, it takes a while to explain. But at that time, you probably all know about A Time for Dying, where Audie gotten in trouble financially, he hadn't been able to finish the film. He needed $350,000 to finish the film. Perfect setup. Frank says, oh, this is our chance. So Audie gets a producer named Rudy Duran, who Frank found out had an association with Dalton. Audie goes to him and says, hey, Rudy, I've got a real problem. I got to come up with $350,000 and the banks won't loan it to me because I'm in the hole and I got all, these other problems and I need to find a private investor that would be willing to go in. And Rudy says, oh, I know this guy, Dalton Smith. And Audie goes, who's he? And they've been investigating this guy. So Audie gets introduced to Dalton and Audie, one of the things that he did to make money was to endorse products, especially guns and things like that. Well, the way Dalton conned everybody is he got celebrities to promote whatever con he was working on. First he came to Audie and said, oh, would you like to do a commercial about cemeteries? Terry says, Dad comes in sputtering away, commercial about cemeteries. He says, I'm not doing that. And he turned it down, which was probably good because he didn't look like he was real anxious to do business with Dalton. Anyway, Dalton had this it was a shell company that he was buying up a whole bunch of bankrupt companies and putting in the shell. And he promoted himself as a person who rehabilitated bankrupt companies. And he'd put them in there and he'd cross-collateralize and brag, make them look really good. And he was holding back like 6 million shares. Anyway, he was doing all this publicity about this glamorous company was selling on the over-the-counter market and on Wall Street. They were running the price up by getting Audie Murphy to endorse it. Of course, it was totally safe, and run the price up, and then he was going to cash out and make millions on this stuff that he was selling. And so Audie went right along with the whole thing, and he's getting all the goods on this. Well, Dalton's one sister, Frances Pecora, was Carlos Marcello's personal secretary. And her husband was the top lieutenant running his crime family in New Orleans. And the other sister was married to another top lieutenant in Marcello's organization that was in charge of all the gambling and wire services for the mafia. So Audie worms his way in. Dalton invites him over. Why don't you come on over and see my sister? Let's just move in. And I actually talked to Frances Pecora. Oh, we just loved Audie. He was so wonderful. He didn't say much. And he was so shy. He didn't want his picture taken out in public with this, But they just loved him. And they just invited him right into their house. And they're talking about all the stuff they're doing. So that was what Audie was working on when Clayton said, whoa, wait a second, we don't want to take the Chicago Mafia guy to trial right now because he's working on another very important case. Now, and then he got, part of the problem was, it's very complicated, it's all explained in the book. I tried to simplify it as much as I could because it took Terry and I years, literally, to unravel this whole thing and talk to enough people that we got it figured out. The mafia wanted Jimmy Hoffa out of prison because Jimmy Hoffa was funding their casinos and everything. And Ed Parton hated Jimmy Hoffa, and he had testified against Jimmy Hoffa and put Jimmy Hoffa in prison. So they wanted him out. So they were offering $1 million to anybody who could get Parton to recant. And Dalton had tried and didn't get anywhere. They said, gee, Audie, why don't you try? He said, sure, I'll try. So he goes down and sees Ed. Says, Ed, for $1 million, would you recant and help get Hoffa out of prison? No. Audie says, okay, so you don't like these guys. And he hated Marcello and everything. And so Audie and the partners, both Doug and Ed, were working together to try to entrap the Carlos Marcello organization. And what they came up with, I mean, this is so crazy, but I have it under authority from the people that did it. Ed made Audie the business manager for the Baton Rouge Teamsters. And the Southern Conference of Teamsters had said if Ed could get Hoffa out of prison, they put him in charge of all the Southern Conference of Teamsters money, which equaled about the pensions that Hoffa had. So Audie and Ed cook up this thing, and they go back and say, we don't need Hoffa. Audie's the new business manager. And you can get all the Teamster money you want through the Southern Conference of Teamsters. So they were in the process of proving that Audie could do that by buying modular homes up in, in Martinsdale. And he was on that plane going up there to close this deal, which was the test deal that had to go through to get these guys to buy into what they were doing when the plane crashed. And unfortunately, that was the end of the investigation, and also Fifi Bussieri got off scot-free and died safe and home in his bed. So it's a fascinating story, and it sounds unbelievable, and that's what Terry said. He said, people are never going to believe this story. And I said, well, we have to have it really well documented, and that it can't be refuted. We have the actual people that were involved on tape. Most of them have now passed away, but we have the tape recordings, and we posted the transcripts from these people on our website, and we're going to be preserving the tapes down at the Texas Heritage Museum because they're a little bit better set up in there, you know. So those things will be available for people, researchers that really want to see. And it was just so important to Terry to get this information published, but he just had too many personal memories and things to be able to write about his dad. And I told him last year, I said, Terry, I'm 75, you're 70, we're getting old, and we don't want this information